Well, hello, baby gorgeouses. It's good to see you again. So today I have another sewing tutorial for you using my newest pattern called the Blythe Baby Doll pattern. It is a blouse and dress pattern with an optional collar and other variations that you can find in the pattern details. And this summer I did a thrift flipping challenge where I tried to do a thrift flip every week of the summer. And I started the series with a men's shirt upcycle, and I thought it would be fun to end the series with another men's shirt upcycle using my Blythe pattern. So that is what I'm going to be doing in today's video. This is the one I'm going to be making today, the one you see me wearing here. I think this like color scheme, the red and white, the eyelet lace, the just overall shape of the garment is really playing into the kind of like farmer's daughter core of it all. Shout out to Pearl. I think it's really cool to emulate Pearl because Pearl is so kind. I'm also really playing it up with these braids I have in my hair. Like, yeah, maybe I grew up milking cows and churning butter. What's it to you? But I think you can get really creative, do some really fun things with this pattern. I think this is a perfect like transitional piece from summer into autumn, and you can find the full pattern on my Etsy store called Sunday School Patterns. It will also be linked in the description below. I also have to say, there are so many new people here than there were in my last video. That's really epic and cool, and I want to say welcome. If you have any video requests, kinds of content you'd like me to make, I'm hoping to like upgrade my setup in the near future, get a really like nice dedicated sewing space, do more long form content because I find it really fun and satisfying, and overall just build a better community online with you guys. Anyways, so that's my spiel. So why don't we just get into the sewing tutorial? So we are going to start by cutting up our button-down shirt, and we will need to be quite strategic about this in order to maximize the available fabric from the shirt. So I'm starting just by cutting off the sleeves and cutting along the side seams to separate the front and the back of the shirt like so. I also seam ripped along the button placket so that I can open it up like so, which is going to be important for later on. Then I fully detached it from the shirt by cutting it off while leaving about 1 centimeter of seam allowance on the side edge, and I repeated this on the other side of the shirt with the buttonhole side of the button placket. Now I'm opening up one of my sleeves and figuring out how I'm going to cut out my sleeve pattern, and I figured out that I had to place it sideways on the sleeve of the shirt like this to fit the full pattern piece, which, yes, it changes the grain line of this piece, but I don't really think it's that big of a deal. The only thing that would really impact this would be like if you had an obviously directional pattern on the shirt that you're working with, like stripes or something like that. Also, I'm using the cap sleeve length included with the pattern. You also want to be sure to transfer the notches of the pattern onto your fabric, and obviously you'll want to cut 2 of these pieces, 1 for each sleeve of the shirt. And if your fabric has an obvious like right and wrong side to it, you'll need to make sure that these pieces are mirrored so that you have a left and a right sleeve. Then I placed my front pieces on top of each other so I could cut out my gathered blouse pieces. So as you can see, I'm not able to get the full width of my pattern piece from this portion of the shirt. So what I need to do is basically split up my pattern piece. So on my pattern, I'm going to mark the points where the fabric ends. Then I just draw a straight line and cut the pattern along this line. Then I can cut out most of my blouse, and at the side seam, I'm going to leave an extra centimeter or so for seam allowance. Then I'm going to take the remainder of my sleeves to cut out the other portion of the blouse, and again I'm going to leave an extra centimeter or so for seam allowance at the side seam. And just so you know, this is the only time you will need to add seam allowance to the pattern. Then to cut out my back blouse, I'm folding the back of the shirt in half and placing my pattern piece along that fold line. As you can see, I don't have quite enough fabric to get the full width of the back, but it's not anything crazy, so I just made this piece a little bit more narrow than normal. Then we can cut out our front and back yokes. So I'm using the top portion of the shirt for these pieces. Again, I'm just placing both sides of the front of the shirt on top of each other so that I can cut my left and right front yoke at once. Likewise, I'm folding the back of the shirt so that I can cut my back yoke on the fold. You'll also need to cut out the yoke pieces in a lining fabric, which you can use really any spare fabric in your collection or something like a thrifted pillowcase. So now we'll need to join our front blouse pieces together. So just pin both pieces together along that cut line, right sides together. And remember, you'll need a left and a right side, so make sure that you have a mirrored pair that looks like this. Then you can sew along those seams with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. Finish the raw edges however you'd like and press the seam allowance towards the side seams. Now we'll join our yoke together at the shoulder seams, so just pin the front yoke pieces to the back yoke at those shoulder seams, and do this for both your outer fabric and the lining. Then sew along those seams with 1 centimeter of seam allowance and press the seams open. Then we're going to match our main fabric and lining right sides together and pin along the neckline, making sure to match up our shoulder seams. Now we can sew all along the neckline with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. Once you finish sewing, trim and grade your seam allowance. So I like to cut my main fabric seam allowance down to around 6 millimeters and the lining seam allowance to around 2 millimeters. Then we're going to press our seam allowance towards the lining all the way around the neckline to prepare for understitching. Then we can understitch the neckline by sewing the seam allowance to the lining. Here I'm working on the right side of the fabric and I'm sewing about 2 millimeters away from the neckline seam, making sure that I'm catching the seam allowance as I sew. Then you'll just want to give that neckline a good press to make sure it's laying nice and flat. And just to note as well, we will now be treating our main fabric and lining as one layer from now on. So just to add some detail, I'm going to add some lace trim along the gathered blouse of the top. So I'm just pinning some along the top edge of my blouse pieces, both the front pieces and the back piece. Now we need to sew some gathering stitches along the tops of these pieces. So to do this, you'll turn your stitch length up to the highest setting and sew your first row about 6 millimeters away from the edge of the fabric without backstitching at the beginning or end. You'll then sew another row right below that one, about 12 millimeters away from the edge of the fabric. Then you can pull on those threads to gather up the fabric. I like to gather my pieces to about the width of the yoke pieces before pinning those pieces right sides together like so. So you just continue to adjust your gathers so that the entire blouse pieces fits the yoke. Then you can sew these pieces together with 1 centimeter of seam allowance, which should allow you to sew right in between your gathering stitches, which will help you get really nice, even gathers. After you finish that, you can remove your gathering stitches and finish your seam allowance with an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. When you go to press your seam allowance, I would suggest pressing it upwards if you've added lace trim, because it'll help the lace on the outside to lay downwards, but if you didn't add any lace, you can just press the seam allowance downwards as usual. Now we will move on to our sleeves, and I'm going to add lace trim to these as well. So I just pinned some of that lace trim to the cuff of the sleeves, right sides together like so. Then I just stitched that in place with about 1 centimeter of seam allowance and finished the seam allowance with my overlocker and pressed the seam allowance upwards like so. And if you don't want to add any lace trim to the sleeves, you can always refer to the pattern instructions for finishing the sleeves. So on the sleeve pattern, there are 5 points that you need to be aware of. So the first single notch is the front notch, and the notch beside it is the first gather point. On the other side, the double notch denotes the back notch, and the single notch beside it is the other gather point. And that notch right in the middle is the shoulder point of the sleeve. So we need to sew our gathers from gather point to gather point, which again are those 2 inside notches. So again, you'll sew 2 rows of gather stitches, just like you did for the blouse pieces, from notch to notch. With your blouse laid right sides out like so, you'll want to pin your sleeves to the armholes. So that double notch needs to match to the seam connecting the back yoke and the back blouse. So go ahead and pin that in place, as well as the underarm points. Likewise, that outer single notch needs to match the seam connecting the front yoke and the front blouse. So you can go ahead and match those up and pin. You will also need to match the very middle notch to the shoulder seam and pin that in place. Then you can gather up the sleeves until the sleeve fits into the armhole and pin it all in place. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and sew the sleeve to the blouse with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. When you're done sewing, you can remove the gather threads and finish the seam allowance however you'd like, and press it inwards towards the body of the garment. Then we need to close our side seams. So basically you're going to place the front and back blouse right sides together and pin all along the side seam, including the sleeves. Then you can sew these seams closed with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. Once you've reached the underarm point, you can pivot your fabric by keeping your needle down, lifting your presser foot, and turning your fabric so you can keep sewing the rest of the seam. So I'm going to make a channel at the end of my sleeve for my elastic. So first I'm going to measure all the way around that sleeve cuff. Then I'm going to cut 2 strips of single folded bias tape that are the same length as my sleeve cuff measurement. Then to join the ends of my bias tape, I'm going to unfold the ends and match them right sides together like you see me doing here. Then you need to sew a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner like this. When you've done that, you can trim the seam allowance down and use your iron or even just your fingers to press the seam allowance open and refold the edges of your bias tape like so that you end up with a continuous loop of bias tape. Now you can pin the bias tape all around the cuff of the sleeve, and the placement here doesn't really matter, but for mine I placed it on top of the seam allowance that's connecting the lace and the sleeve. The really important thing here is that it's pinned at the same distance from the edge of the sleeve all the way around. So then you can sew along the top edge of that bias tape all the way around the sleeve cuff. Then you need to sew along the other edge of the bias tape, but this time you'll need to leave a small gap so that we can insert our elastic, so just finish sewing a few centimeters away from the start of your stitching. Then you can cut 2 pieces of elastic that are about the same length as the circumference of your bicep with an additional 1 centimeter or so. Attach a small safety pin to the end of the elastic so that you can insert it into your channel. Once your elastic reaches the other side, overlap the ends of the elastic and sew them together by zigzag stitching along the overlapped ends a few times. Then you can go ahead and pull on your elastic and sew your gap closed. So at this point, I hemmed my blouse all the way around, but I realized after making this that it probably would have been a bit easier to just hem it after attaching the button placket, but it's kind of up to you if you want to hem it now or later. So moving on to our button plackets, I'm just going to button it up at the top and mark where I'd like the neckline to hit. Then I'm going to draw another line that's 2 centimeters away for seam allowance, and then I'm going to cut my button placket along this line. So I'm going to start by working with the button side of my button placket, which was on the right side of the original shirt, which means I'll have to attach it to the right side of the garment. So I'm going to lay my garment right side out along with the button placket. Then I can flip my button placket to face my blouse right sides together, and I'm going to make sure I align my neckline with the point marked on my button placket. Then I'm just going to pin those together, matching up the edges, and then you just want to sew that in place with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. So since we seam ripped out the button placket, we are able to iron the seam allowance towards the inside of the button placket, which is going to make it invisible from both the inside and the outside. Once you've ironed that seam allowance, you can top stitch the button placket to secure it in place just by sewing right beside the seam you just sewed about 2 millimeters away. Then you just need to hem the top and bottom of the button placket by pressing inwards twice by 1 centimeter and stitching in place. So for the other side of the button placket, I have to sew it a little bit differently because of the way it was constructed on the original shirt. So as you can see, I'm not able to just pin it right sides together with my blouse because I wouldn't be able to hide my seam allowance inside the placket later on. So instead, I have to pin it wrong sides together to my blouse, which is what you're seeing me do here. Depending on how your original shirt was made, you might be able to do what we did previously for the other side. You just need to figure out how to pin it to the blouse in a way so that you'll be able to hide the seam allowance inside the button placket. Anyways, once I had finished pinning that to my blouse, I just sewed it in place with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. Then I just pressed the seam allowance inside the button placket like before and top stitched it in place. Finally, I hemmed the top and bottom of the placket and I was finished sewing. Comment below to let me know if you enjoyed this tutorial, and please tag me on my socials if you decide to try this project. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye everyone.